December 17th, 1944. 05:30 hours, Honsfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank's engine coughed, sputtered, then died. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch. The metallic clang echoed through the pre-dawn silence like a gunshot. His driver, Unterscharführer Weber, twisted the key, desperate. He tried to restart the 700-horsepower Maybach engine. Nothing. Dead silence. The fuel gauge stared back, empty. With a tight voice, barely holding panic, Obersturmbannführer Weber shouted from his compartment, "The reserve tank! It's dry!" Peiper climbed down from his command tank, his boots crunching on the frozen Belgian soil. All around him sat the most powerful armored spearhead the Wehrmacht had assembled for Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes Offensive. But motionless, stalled, helpless. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers, all paralyzed by empty fuel tanks. Through the morning mist, Peiper's eyes locked on the abandoned American position ahead, Honsfeld, a critical supply depot for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had fled so fast, so recklessly, they'd left fires still burning in oil drums, coffee cups still warm, like soldiers caught mid-meal. And then, there it stood before him. Rows upon rows of jerry cans, thousands of them, olive-drab containers gleaming under pale light like treasure, like gifts from the god of war himself. Peiper approached, slowly, reverently. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruller, pried open one can. He sniffed it, inhaled benzene and high-octane gasoline like a starving man catching scent of bread. His men scrambled, hands trembling, as they began refueling their vehicles, desperate to sip life from the enemy's veins. Peiper walked among the stockpile, counting. The mathematics were staggering. 50,000 gallons, he murmured, enough to fuel his entire combat group for the push to the Meuse River, enough to potentially change the course of the offensive. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this single depot than most German divisions had received in the past 6 months. But as he stood among this bounty, as he watched his men pour American fuel into German tanks, a crushing realization settled over him like the morning fog. Germany hadn't merely miscalculated. Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its enemy.
6 months before Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had delivered a report that should have ended all offensive operations immediately. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the bloodline of the Wehrmacht, had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The refineries that once produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April managed only 5,000 tons by September. The hydrogenation plants at Pillitz, Blechhammer, and Bruck were operating at less than 10% capacity. The numbers whispered inevitable defeat. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including all synthetic production and captured Romanian fields, managed 33 million barrels, less than 2% of America's output. The Third Reich was attempting to wage mechanized warfare with horse-drawn logistics. While America drowned its armies in petroleum abundance, Major Friedrich Simon of the Wehrmacht Logistics Command had calculated that the Ardennes Offensive would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel just to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million gallons, but only half was delivered due to transportation problems. The German High Command was betting the entire offensive on capturing enemy supplies, a strategy revealing terminal weakness rather than strength. The Americans, meanwhile, had constructed a petroleum pipeline system across France called Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean, and the Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system delivering 12,500 tons of supplies daily to the front lines. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day and receiving 1.4 million gallons, building reserves while fighting. Joachim Peiper was no fool. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had learned that in modern warfare, fuel was more precious than ammunition. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire Ardennes Offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before the attack, Peiper attended the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, was blunt. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies." The fuel allocation for Kampfgruppe Peiper was 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles of combat. The distance to the Meuse was 65 miles. The mathematics of failure were built into the plan from the beginning. As his column prepared to advance on December 16th, Peiper issued strict orders. Tanks would operate in single file to conserve fuel. Engines would be shut off during any halt longer than 5 minutes. The capture of American fuel dumps was priority 1, above even tactical objectives. The contrast with American operations could not have been starker. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles from Peiper's starting position, recorded in his unit diary, "Received fuel resupply 8,000 gallons, third delivery this week. Storage tanks already at capacity."
December 17th, 1944. 05:30 hours. Honsfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank's engine coughed, sputtered, then died. SS Oberscharführer Bonjura Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch, the metallic sound cutting through the stillness like a warning shot. His driver,
Unterscharführer over, twisted desperately at the ignition, attempting to restart the mighty 700 horsepower Maybach engine. Nothing. Only silence. The fuel gauge read empty. The reserve tank is also dry, over-cold from his compartment, his voice taut with barely contained fear. Peiper climbed down from his command tank. His boots crunched on the frozen Belgian soil like shattered glass. All around him, the Wehrmacht's proud armored spearhead, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers sat motionless. The greatest force assembled for Operation Watch on the Rhine, paralyzed by empty fuel tanks. Through the morning mist, Peiper's eyes locked on the abandoned American position ahead. Honsfeld, a vital supply depot for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had fled in such haste they'd left fires still burning in oil drums, coffee still steaming in metal cups, and only in the wildest of hopes, lined up like treasure from the gods, thousands upon thousands of olive-drab American fuel containers, jerry cans stretching endlessly. Peiper approached slowly, almost reverently. His adjutant, Halbedienführer Hans Gruller, pried open one can, bringing it close to his nose. He inhaled deeply, benzene and high-octane gasoline, his eyes widening as his men plunged into frantic labor, filling German tanks with American fuel. Peiper walked among the stacked containers, counting. The numbers were staggering. 50,000 gallons. Enough to fuel his entire Kampfgruppe for the push toward the Meuse River. Enough to possibly turn the tide. The Americans had abandoned more fuel here than entire German divisions had received in 6 months. But as Peiper stood amid this mountain of abundance, watching his men pour precious gasoline into their tanks, a crushing realization spread like fog across his mind. If the Americans could afford to leave this much behind, if they could abandon fuel that Germany would guard with entire divisions, then this war was already lost. Germany hadn't simply miscalculated, it had fundamentally misunderstood its enemy. 6 months before this morning at Honsfeld, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented a report that should have ended all offensive operations. Germany's synthetic fuel supply, the bloodline of its mechanized warfare, had been systematically destroyed by relentless Allied bombing. The synthesis fuel plants that had produced 175,000 tons in April 1944 were churning out a mere 5,000 tons by September 1944. Hydrogenation plants at Pitz, Bleyhammer, and Bruck were operating at less than 10% capacity. The numbers told a story of inevitable defeat. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including synthetic production and captured Romanian fields, managed only 33 million, less than 2% of American output. The Third Reich was attempting to wage mechanized warfare on horse-drawn logistics. While America drowned its armies in petroleum abundance, Major Friedrich Simon of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command calculated the Ardennes Offensive would require 4.5 million gallons to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million gallons, but only half was delivered due to transport failures. The German High Command was betting everything on capturing enemy supplies, a strategy born not of strength, but terminal weakness.
Meanwhile, the Americans had built a petroleum pipeline system called Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean, and the Red Ball Express, a convoy operation delivering 12,500 tons of supplies daily to the front lines. By December 1944, American forces in Europe consumed 1.2 million gallons daily and were receiving 1.4 million gallons. They stockpiled reserves even while fighting. Joachim Peiper was no fool. At just 29 years old, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he learned firsthand that fuel was more precious than ammunition in modern warfare. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the Ardennes Offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before the attack, Peiper attended a final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, had been blunt. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse only if you capture American supplies." The fuel allocation for Peiper's Kampfgruppe was a mere 31,000 gallons, enough for just 50 miles of combat operations. The Meuse lay 65 miles away. The mathematics of failure had been built into the plan from the start. As his column readied to move on December 16th, Peiper issued strict orders. Tanks would travel in single file to conserve fuel. Engines would be shut off if halted for longer than 5 minutes. Capturing American fuel dumps would be priority 1, above even tactical objectives. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles away from Peiper's starting point, recorded in his unit diary, "Received fuel resupply, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks already at capacity." December 16th, 1944. 05:30 hours. The German artillery barrage that launched Operation Watch on the Rhine used more ammunition in 2 hours than Germany had allocated for entire campaigns earlier in the war. But this impressive firepower masked crippling shortages. Peiper's column finally began moving at 7 a.m., already behind schedule. Roads that German maps promised as highways turned out to be narrow country lanes, many unpaved. Within hours, traffic jams snarled the convoy as vehicles designed for the Russian steppe struggled through Ardennes forests. At Lanzarote, Peiper's first objective, they ran into fierce resistance, not from an army, but from a lone American reconnaissance platoon of just 18 men. These brave souls held the most powerful German armored column at bay for nearly 10 hours. During this delay, vehicles idled endlessly, burning precious fuel. By the time they broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, Peiper's column had covered only 20 miles and consumed 40% of their fuel. At that rate, they would run dry before reaching even the halfway mark. The American supply depot at Honsfeld wasn't even a major facility. It was a forward fuel point, a temporary station for the 99th Infantry Division. But what Peiper discovered exceeded the fuel allotment of an entire German panzer division. Hauptmannsführer Hans Gruller later testified, "We found pyramids of jerry cans, each containing 5 gallons of gasoline, stacked 3 meters high for nearly 200 meters. The Americans hadn't even bothered to destroy them." The captured fuel was a high-octane aviation blend, mixed with motor fuel of 80 octane or higher. German vehicles, especially the finicky Maybach engines in Tiger tanks, were designed for 74 octane.
The American fuel was so potent, it caused engine problems in several vehicles. As his men refueled, more discoveries came to light. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann found shipping manifests in the depot office. He could read English, having worked in his father's import business before the war. The documents revealed fuel shipped from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, through the Channel to Normandy, and trucked 400 miles to Honsfeld. A journey of over 6,000 miles completed in under 6 weeks. "I showed the papers to Oberscharführer Bannerer Peiper," Hoffmann recalled years later. "He read them twice, then crumpled them. He said nothing, but his face went pale. We both understood what it meant." Private Ernst Karrer stumbled upon stacks of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The headlines boasted of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons daily. One pipeline supplying more fuel per day than Peiper's Kampfgruppe could use in the entire offensive. To grasp the shock of this discovery, one must understand the reality faced by the Wehrmacht in the final months of 1944. American bombing raids had cratered rail lines, destroyed storage depots, and ravaged refining centers at Merseburg and Lona. Reports indicated fuel shortages, forcing commanders to ration gasoline, sometimes limiting field operations to a single attack before retreating. By October 1944, some panzer divisions had fuel reserves for only 48 hours of combat.
Despite these setbacks, the German High Command launched the Ardennes Offensive, betting that a sudden strike would cut Allied supply lines and reverse the tide of war. But Peiper's encounter at Honsfeld told another story. His men gorged themselves on the spoils, but the victory tasted hollow. Even with captured fuel, the odds were stacked against them. As the morning sun rose over the Belgian fields, it cast long shadows over the abandoned jerry cans and over the hopes of an entire army. As December 18th, 1944 dawned, the chilling winds of the Ardennes swept through frost-covered trees. Honsfeld's supply depot had already become a ghost town, abandoned by retreating Americans, but its bounty was a cruel gift to the German soldiers. They stared at mountains of jerry cans, stacked as if mocking them. By noon that day, Tiger tanks sat idling, their engines growling in frustration, consuming precious fuel while waiting to move forward. Otto Dingler, the maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, scratched his head, frustration etched across his face. By noon, he murmured, we had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began, and we had captured maybe 55,000. The arithmetic was unforgiving. It wasn't just fuel anymore. It was hope, or the lack of it. Across the lines, American forces had intercepted German radio transmissions. The Allies knew. General Courtney Hodges, stern and resolute, gave orders to all units. Enemy critically short of fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. It was a strategy born not from cruelty, but necessity. A desperate shield against German advance. On that same day, American C-47s, propeller engines whining like bees, flew 316 sorties to deliver supplies to Bastogne. Among those sorties, 160,000 gallons of fuel were flown in, enough to keep aircraft roaring through the sky. The Allies were not just surviving, they were suffocating their enemy by abundance. By December 19th, the reality had set in. As German forces engaged defenders at Staumont, the fuel crisis turned catastrophic. Tanks abandoned their posts, engines silent, not from enemy fire, but from thirst. The grim sight spread like frostbite across ranks. Colonel Hans Gruller later recounted how they scavenged tanks. We drained the last fuel, maybe 200 gallons total, he confessed, voice hollow with shame. The Oberst stood there, staring at the blackened engines, then ordered them destroyed. Millions of Reichsmarks reduced to scrap, disabled by emptiness. Of 5,000 men who marched with Colonel Peiper at the onset of the offensive, barely 770 returned. They had advanced 60 miles, seen victories, massacres, and ultimately the truth. The enemy's strength was not bullets or bravery, but barrels of fuel. That night, by firelight, soldiers huddled together, faces gaunt. No maps, no movement, no fuel. Just silence and the looming collapse. Even German commanders, hardened by war, felt the sting of hopelessness. General Hasso von Montefiore later wrote, "When I learned Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk capture, I knew the offensive had failed before it began." Captain Friedrich von den Herr, interrogated after being captured, confessed, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" That one sentence encapsulated the abyss separating 2 worlds.
By December 21st, the noose tightened. Colonel Peiper, trapped at La Glaise, could see American forces converging. The 31st Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, the 3rd Armored, all backed by unimaginable reserves. His personal fuel reserves dwindled to about 1,000 gallons. A single cup of coffee could consume more fuel than his entire force possessed. Patton's Third Army pivoted north with 350,000 gallons of fuel in reserve. Fuel that German planners deemed impossible to deliver in 3 days. On December 23rd, clear skies welcomed waves of aircraft. 2,000 sorties flew that day alone, each consuming more fuel than the Luftwaffe had seen in months. P-47 Thunderbolts consumed 300 gallons per hour. B-26 Marauders burned 200 gallons per hour. A single day's operations devoured more fuel than Germany's entire offensive allotment. By the night of December 23rd, 24th, Colonel Peiper abandoned his tanks. Under cover of darkness, his soldiers slipped through American lines on foot. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that had begun the offensive, 39 remained, and even those were paralyzed. By dawn, they too were destroyed. Colonel Heinz Gullis recalled the scene with a hollow laugh. "We drained the last fuel from all vehicles, maybe 200 gallons total. The Oberscharfer personally destroyed his command tank. Machines worth millions discarded like bones. Of 5,000 men, only 770 staggered home. They had marched, fought, and learned the cruel mathematics of industrial warfare." On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received reports on captured American supplies. His chief of staff recorded his reaction. He read the numbers twice, then trembled. 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed rather than captured. Model whispered, "We are not fighting the same war." Even Hitler, presented with the facts, refused to believe them. He dismissed photographs of burning depots as Hollywood illusions. But lower ranks, they knew.
Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife, "Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly. They drive tanks like we march." The revelation shattered illusions. The fuel crisis was not an isolated problem. It was the symptom of systemic collapse. By 1944, Allied bombing campaigns had crippled Germany's synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe grounded aircraft for lack of aviation fuel. Pilot training dropped from 250 hours to just 60. German civilians hadn't seen a private car since 1942. Farmers plowed fields with horses. Gasoline so precious that black market thefts were investigated down to the liter. Meanwhile, the United States produced 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas oil fields alone outproduced all German-occupied Europe. American refineries operating at full capacity experimented with new byproducts simply because they had excess crude. Against this backdrop, Colonel Peiper's nightmare at Honsfeld was inevitable.
As the smoke of battle fades and the echoes of empty fuel tanks disappear into history, we remember not just the bravery of soldiers, but the relentless power of industry, and how numbers, supplies, and sheer abundance shaped the outcome of a war. It's in these stories of sacrifice, of perseverance, of impossible odds that we find lessons for today. If this story touched your heart, if it opened a window into the lives of those who fought and endured, please support the channel by hitting that like button. And subscribe to join us as we uncover more untold tales from the past. Every click helps us bring these stories to life, for history to be remembered, not forgotten. Thank you for listening, for sharing this journey with us, and for keeping the memories of courage alive. See you in the next story. Until then, take care and stay curious.